Yeah. And very good.
Also, I'd like to introduce you, if that's all right. May I introduce you?
Just please.
Okay. Just take up the other mic. Good morning, everyone. I'd just like to take a moment to introduce our Everett K. Gray. The green light's on. You need it. Closer to your mouth. Did it die? Did it die?
Oh, it shares the same as his.
Oh, okay.
Is this one working?
Yeah. And he's got one that works. You're good with what you have. Don't worry. Thank you, Christina. All right, for posterity, today is July 31st, 2023, and I'd like to introduce our Everett K. Bray visiting lecturer, Reverend Dr. Jim Lawrence.
Hello, everybody. It's really good to be here. I'm going to try to keep us on in good pace. It's interesting that it's the Everett K. Bray lecture series every year. That was George Dole's senior pastor when he first began congregational leadership as the assistant pastor at the Cambridge Church, and he often had fond memories about Reverend Bray. The title of my book, as it was published, this talk was to be about this book, the next to the last book that George Dole published, called A Book About Us, the Bible and the Stages of Our Lives. My talk is going to be especially about what led up to this book, a journey that I walked very closely with George Dole, a very powerful Bible teacher, my primary Bible teacher as a Swedenborgian, but one of the tremendously creative thinkers that I've had the pleasure to work with. Could I have the next slide, please? So this book was a quarter century in the making. George taught Bible from 1969 until 2016 to Swedenborgian students. Even after he retired from Swedenborg School of Religion, we continued with him at the seminary as it moved to Berkeley, moving into virtual technology, the first school to move into virtual technology at the Graduate Theological Union, because we wanted to be having a professor who was living in Maine as a teacher in our biblical curriculum. And so for decades he taught a lot of Swedenborgian ministers and licensed pastors to become students of Swedenborg Bible, as we often called it, in many different ways. And he developed a particular approach to Scripture that became very distinctive. Could I have the next slide, please? So let's remember that George was his mother's child. Here we have, he was born in Freiburg. He was born right here. His father, Louis Dole, here, was a minister at the church at that time, 1932. That's when he was born. And there's his mother, Anita Sturgis, who of course is the mastermind, the tremendously productive, creative, brilliant creator of the 4-year cycle of Bible study readings are in 6 volumes that are back there. We might also remember that George Dole's sister, Louise, marries a Swedenborgian minister, Bill Wolfenden, who is the executive editor of the Bible study notes. What's important about mentioning this part of George's upbringing is that in that study that he grew up from grade 1 going through these lessons, every year, every age group travels from Genesis to Revelation. And then the next year, you travel from Genesis to Revelation again with a different set of readings. The third year continuing, the fourth year continuing. So every year in Sunday school, every age group has the experience of traveling kind of at some sort of pace across the entire text of the Bible. That becomes an important framework in George's understanding about engaging text, that you're always engaging any part of the Bible in relationship to a larger story, all right? And so, can I have the next slide, please? Something important happened in the spring of 1981. A book came out called The Stages of Faith. This book becomes the best-selling book in religious studies for the decade of the 80s. It's an enormously powerful book. This is just the spring of 81. Bells started clanging in George's mind, and by the fall of that same year, he developed a new course that he taught at the seminary that he simply called English Bible. So, of course, George was famously a linguist. He knew 17 languages to some extent. He had a master's from Oxford in Hebrew. He took Greek at Yale and in high school. A tremendous Latinist. He was into languages. This, though, was English Bible. It was like, we're going to get into the text in your language and understand the story from Genesis to Revelation, and he's going to put it in dialogue with James Fowler's Stages of Faith. And so that class was for the spring of the fall of 81, which is the year I first came to Boston to study with Swedenborgians, and I was in that class. Could we have the next slide, please? So the key word in Fowler that's going to be a key framework for George for the rest of his life is the idea of stages. That there's a sort of stage construction of our journeys if we grow. That people don't grow spiritually in completely chaotic, haphazard, idiosyncratic ways. That to become wise, loving beings starts to have really common stepping stones for everybody who walks the stairway to heaven, right? And so stage theory is looking at the formation phases of how growth happens. It's also fundamental in developmental psychology, especially for kindergarten through high school. The developmental theory is mostly used in educational worlds these days because you can see the development needed from grade to grade to grade to grade as the brain gets bigger, more complex, and the capacity to do exercises, have learning experiences, being able to absorb prior learning experiences and build on them is a terrific sort of curriculum for how growth happens. In psychology and spirituality, stage theory continues to have a long life. And there are many theorists who have worked with the idea in other faith traditions besides Christianity of this idea that you can see a pattern that's common to spiritual formation. And that you can see that there's levels, there are growth, there's like stair steps, and it's called stage theory. There's two kinds of stage theory that's very famous, or two types of developmental models that are famous. One is vertical, growing up. So I mentioned yesterday, for those who happen to be there in the sermon, that Swedenborg starts the writings, obviously, of course, with the Arcana Celestia, where he begins verse by verse with Genesis 1. The very first part of Genesis is the first creation story, the 6 days of creation. Swedenborg builds a stage theory in his discussion of those 6 days. They aren't 24-hour periods. They aren't generalized periods. They're levels of accomplishment in the internal spiritual formation of a human being, because the creation story's not about the creation of the physical universe. It's about the creation of you and me. It's about the creation of participatory love. It's about the creation of consciousness structures that can participate in the wholeness of the divine power, which are these participants in the cosmos with God who become wise lovers. So we're the creation, and there's these 6 days, and Swedenborg comments that many people don't get past day one, or don't get past even day one, and day two. It really thins out, and he's just observing what's going on with spiritual formation in his time. It really starts to thin out at day 3, right? Which is a pretty important day in the stage theory of Genesis 1. Anyway, Swedenborg himself starts out with a stage theory, and George tracks that in his beginning work with this. For that first year, he began writing a manuscript in terms of the journey to this book. This is the 3rd manuscript that, but the only one that gets published, that he begins shaping his stage theory with the Bible story as a way of any one of us can engage human development as we understand our own lives as we've lived through possibly parts of these stages. And that manuscript is called The Pilgrimage. So the vertical one is like Swedenborg's. It's that you can grow up. The famous saying is, anyone can grow old, but not all of us grow up, right? And that's referring to the ethical evolution of wise, loving capacities in our operative system as human beings, so that the stages are vertical, and each stage higher in terms of our evolution as wise lovers is built on what we learned at earlier experiences. Famously, and some people know about this one even more, and this was all started by Jean Piaget, who studied how the brain in small children, you could track as the brain actually grew and grew more complex, that the thinking capacities were evolving in relationship to brain growth. And he developed a stage theory for how young people have different learning abilities at different ages. A 7-year-old reasons very differently than a 17-year-old. There's different capacities going on. So that's how that began with the idea of that it gets more complex, and that you learn in higher stages based on what you've already banked from the lower stage accomplishments. But now many people know about lifespan psychology. Erik Erikson, one of the great neo-Freudian psychoanalysts of the 20th century, began studying how people evolve, or how people journey with the phases of their lives. And there is also the possibility of a growth path in lifespan psychology. So this is horizontal, that people who are in their teen years are dealing with different issues than people in their late 20s. And that people in their late 20s are dealing with different issues than they are in middle age. And people in the later phases of life are dealing with different issues than was true in previous issues. But it doesn't mean that there are not life skills that have been built into the strength of an individual that has accrued over the horizontal time of a life. But Erikson focused on being aware that there are different needs, different jobs at hand in different phases of our life. So that was horizontal framework of stage theory. Could I have the next slide, please? I won't spend time with this. Fowler did have his stage theory was vertical, that there is a way in which people can mature within wisdom in the way they understand their faith journey. And so I think many of us understand that we can be very judgmental if we look around the world at the way people frame their faith and how they act in the world and behave in the world, apparently from their faith commitments. Well, Fowler has a critique that comes from a certain perspective that believes that you can kind of identify faith stances and see that there's that he makes judgment calls that you can grow up in your faith that tends to become increasingly more outward looking and integrative of worldviews. But George, could I have the next slide, please? But George, another book that came out the same year as Fowler was Robert Kegan's The Evolving Self, Problem and Process in Human Development. George almost immediately switched to Kegan. It took him about 2 years. He started with Fowler, that's what I knew, but he was doing Kegan like I'm seeing people in the room like Allison. If you took George for Bible, I think you would have had to have read Kegan. I don't know if you remember that, but I have, most of the students I worked with were taking George Dole, and Kegan was always the text. And he carried Kegan with him for the rest of his life. Now Kegan is using stage theory, a vertical stage theory, and the evolving self is the human soul growing towards wholeness. Now Kegan is not a Christian, and he's not putting it in a religious framework in that sense, but he is identifying a kind of increasingly mature, complex individual who has the capacity to be profoundly effective in creative relationships with people around them. So he has a psychosocial approach to his sense of the evolving self. It's how good are we becoming at getting out of our own stuff, taking the goodness of our stuff and having abilities to be useful in community and useful in relationships. And that the ideal life is that we are truly grounded in our principles that we have claimed and owned, and have been able to evolve styles of interacting with the world around us that stimulates creative good things happening in community. So he has his stages here, 6 stages. And as you see the last bullet point, he believed that most people, he's a little like Swedenborg, most people are basically hanging out at stage 3 at best. Swedenborg said almost nobody, he didn't say nobody, but almost nobody reaches day 6 is what he claims in the Arcana that he sees in this world. And the next world, which I'm not sure Kegan has a framework for, next world, a lot of people reach day 6. But in this world, and Kegan say, he's looking around saying only 1% evolved to stage 5. Could I have the next slide, please? So George integrated both forms of stage theory in the way he began processing how to understand the Bible as a book about us. And it's a very complex way to approach Bible because it's very, George was a little anachronist, that means out of his time, because looking at the Bible as a total book that had any kind of internal integration had gone out of fashion with higher criticism as it began to investigate how each book of the Bible was actually shaped, not necessarily in conversation with other texts. But for the longest time in religion, people thought the Bible was God's word to us and that we can trust that it has an internal integration. George is sticking with that Swedenborgian contention that there's an internal integration in the word that makes sense. And so he had a way of going from sticking with his mom's structure, going from Genesis to Revelation that is pegged to lifespan, and it's also building a vertical stage, a wisdom formation as you go through the lifespan. And so in the pilgrimage, he had 7 covenants. A covenant is a deal with God. A covenant means that there's responsibilities, there's a promise, but there's responsibilities that go with it. So in every covenant, these are sort of pegging where we are in our relationship with God, where we are in our sense of our deal that we have with God across this long journey. So the one that I read was Abraham and Sarah being told by God to go there. George pegs this as the first covenant. We're being born. We have, it's all promise. You will be blessed. Anyone who blesses you will be blessed. There will be tremendous blessings if you go through with this. You are born, but there's no responsibilities. There's nothing in this statement at this part of the text that, but to do that, I'm going to need this from you. I'm going to need this from you. No, it's all promise. But an infant has all promise, and at this point doesn't have to take out the trash. And so there's the 7 covenants. The next big one is Moses coming down from Sinai with the 10 commandments. Well, what happens when you become, 7, 8, 9 years old? Suddenly, there's a lot of rules. You learn very quickly in life that there's a bunch of rules that you have to abide by, or some serious pain is coming your way. So suddenly, there's some promise there, but now the responsibilities and accountability has proliferated. And George pegs this as, that will never not be true in our lives. However, if we look at lifespan psychology, the Mosaic covenant, your parents are coming down with the 10 commandments and laying them on the table for you. You will abide by these rules, right? Especially number 4, you will honor your father and mother, right? And so George is building a horizontal stage theory with the second covenant. It's the covenant with the Mosaic covenant. Here are the rules, by the way, in order to make sure you harvest those blessings. And he begins to lay out why. Of course, Swedenborg is famous with the way he treats the 10 Commandments, right? He has the inner sense of the commandments that move to spiritual value. Yeah, you got the literal thing about don't kill. Let's consider that pretty much an automatic one to follow. But we also should not be killing other people through our gossip, right? We should not be taking down people with our slander. We should not be doing spiritual killing of people, right? And then he takes it to the celestial, that we should not be slandering God. We should not be slandering the higher principles of life. So Swedenborg has a lot to do with the Mosaic covenant. It's one of his most powerful spaces of spirituality. So this is what George was doing in the pilgrimage. We won't go through the whole thing. I found it just incredibly brilliant. And I still have my notebook from 1981, 82. And so that's what George is doing with the pilgrimage, and with putting together both horizontal and vertical stage theory. Could I have the next slide, please? Well, I've already gone through this. Here's the 7 covenants. I'm not going to stay with this slide because I want to have time for some discussion. So you can see the 7 covenants. Go there. 10 commandments. Joshua, that was my sermon yesterday in church for those who were there. Where now we're in late teens and moving into early adulthood, we have to start really doing all this hard work to become successful, to get to the good stuff. Then David and Solomon is the peak of professional or motherhood, the peak of owning the world. It's when you're at that age, running business, running homes, running culture, the people who are really in charge at a social level. But then comes midlife crises sometimes, and that's the prophets and the Psalms in George's structure. Like, isn't there something more? Isn't there something more? And and the sense of, the turmoil of prophets, then the breakthrough, the connection with transformative values in living is itself an intrinsic good, and it's itself an intrinsic abiding place. To be in that psychological, spiritual space is being whole, well, and loving life. And that's really having this profound connection with the force of love and life, which is the divine human. And then finally, being in a whole realm of people who have this attainment in the holy city. Now the city is tremendously effective and glamorous. So that was the pilgrimage, which, could I have the next slide, please? Well, here's Swedenborg stage theory. By the way, anybody who wants this presentation can ask me for it, and I'll send it to you. You have to kind of really parse out Swedenborg stage theory in Genesis 1. Could I have the next slide, please? So, I became an agent for George. And I went into publishing, J. Appleseed and Company. I was always with the denominations publishing stuff, on the foundation board with the publishing stuff. I was pushing him all along, you gotta get this published. And so he was developing, he was honing a manuscript that the next version was called The Promised Kingdom. And we submitted it to multiple publishers, and it always got rejected, partly because it's so different than it. I remember one reviewer wrote back and said, so here we're talking about a Bible teacher who's sort of suggesting that you can go land in these places across the biblical narrative and track it like it's a lifespan journey. And, the prophets and Psalm is like the midlife crisis and so forth. And the reviewer said, I mean, it's kind of clever, but it seems a little fanciful. I don't think people will buy into it, right? And so George was disappointed. He always took criticism extremely well. I've never known George to get defensive about, a criticism. He kept working with it, but it was just something that never came to pass. And so he worked, in my sense of it, I stepped away from the project finally. He sort of stepped away from it, but he was continuing to teach Bible in these kinds of ways going forward. And so finally he comes back at it. And let's see, I'm going to take a look here. Yeah, he comes to this book, which is actually quite different from the pilgrimage and the promised kingdom in that he radically shortens every chapter. He makes it primarily a spiritual practice book. There's anywhere from 5 to 7 discussion questions, reflection questions. You can use it for a Bible discussion group. You can use it for personal journaling. He does generally talk about stage theory in a few places, and he certainly indicates in light ways that there's a story from Genesis to Revelation. But yet the chapter segments that have titles like policy questions, chapter 4, questions of power, chapter 5, the shape of the story, chapter 6, liberation, are supported by biblical passages from different parts of the Bible. So he's really kind of stepping back from a tight framework of Genesis to Revelation, and it's a wonderful book to kind of engage a little bit. Can I have my next to the last slide, please? The shifts that happen along the way with his quarter century of working towards a book about us is that he moves away from a theory-heavy approach to one of personal reflection and exercises in chapters that are shaped around a spiritual theme. There's a shift away from emphasizing a large-scale inner sense story from Genesis to Revelation, as I said, and there's a shift away from emphasizing stage theory, which is mentioned briefly for the first time a third of the way into the book. It is not really an organizing principle. Stage theory is implicit behind the pages if you understand what's going on in this book, but he's not front-burnering it for readers. He's front-burnering using the Bible to reflect on issues in your own journey that could be useful for you wherever you are in your stage journey. Last slide, please. So stage theory became the means for George at last, you might say, and not the end. George was always convinced that the best student outcomes in biblical studies arise from facilitating personal inner reflection on one's life experience. When I look at my old notebook from 1981, 1982, there was all these similar kinds of, he's always, famous line from George in terms about all of his reference books, well, first I need to look that up in George. He's always asking us to look it up in ourselves, to access our personal experience, our own sense of what we're going through, and connect with the text at hand. So that was his teaching style, and he never moved away from that. Stage theory gave him a meaningful construct, however, for going very deeply and complexly into the process of regeneration. George Dole's work on Bible is a work about regeneration, because the book has only one message when you get into the inner senses, and that is that we are always the text. There is never any message in the inner sense of the Bible that is not about our regeneration. No matter how the theme starts, it's about how we grow as people. So discovering the power and richness of the inner sense of the Bible for understanding our spiritual potential became a lifelong quest for George, not obviously as a person, but as a biblical scholar and a biblical teacher. And his ability for opening up that book for us continues. Okay, I didn't do too badly. I was hoping to stop at the half the hour past just to have discussions and questions. I'm always happy to ad-lib endlessly.
How do I get a copy of that book?
Of this book?
I'm Ned, and I want a copy of that book. How do I get one?
Well, this book is by the Swedenborg Foundation, and you can go onto the Swedenborg Foundation website and order it. Nancy?
I think that book is out of print, but you can get a used copy of it. There's many sites that have used copies, but I think it's out of print.
Yeah, you're making
I looked for it.
a library kind of contribution for.
I'm just saying that a book about us is out of print from the foundation.
Okay.
But there are sites where you can get it, like Abe Books. There's used sites.
Right. Thank you.
Other comments or questions? So I can put the, I'm Colgate, and I'm the heathen here. Could you put the 6 stages, could you explain them to me so I can put my own life, but also the,
I'm losing transcription.
but so that I could understand the 6 stages as we go through lectures and figure out where I am, because it's sort of a contextual thing to the lecture. We talk about the stages. Could you just hit all 6 of them very briefly?
Right.
So that I then can put your lecture a little bit more into context to that.
Yeah.
If you don't mind staying at the front so people can see you.
Okay.
And then you can answer that question. Sorry to relocate you.
Can you repeat it for me?
He wants to know the 6 stages. So one of your slides had that. Did you want that slide back? Or maybe we can get print-ups of that page.
6 stages of Keegan, 6 stages of Fowler, 6 stages of Dole. Which one? Well, I'll tell you what. I can send it to you, Colgate, the 6 covenants that George Dole developed. Yeah? Yeah.
This is Susanna. I just wanted to comment that I was in seminary in the 90s, and we used that promised kingdom as our text.
Wow.
And when A Book About Us came out, which we thought it was going to be that, it was a disappointment because it didn't have the depth that Promised Kingdom had,
Right.
and the chronological
Yes.
approach?
Well, I mean, just sort of an insider comment from the publishing world. I was on the Swedenborg Foundation board at the time the 2007 book actually came out. I was not directly involved in it, but I know that there was pressure for George to produce something that would be easily accessible to the average reader. So it's not a book for seminarians.
Right.
It's a book for general spiritual practice.
But the Promised Kingdom is
But
wonderful.
thank you, I did not know that.
Yeah,
That the
that was the
Promised
text.
Kingdom, well, it makes sense to me because I know he was always using a manuscript with the class, and that he had ditched the pilgrimage as a title in the late 80s. Yeah. Gardner.
First of all, I think all of us would like to thank you, Jim. That was a wonderful, wonderful talk, and a real, we don't have to clap right now, but a real tribute to George, and you've given a wonderful reprise of his career. So I'm a student of George as well. I can speak to the present question just from a little different perspective. As we know from Jim's talk, George starts as a scholar. He never left that. And he always had his stage theory knowledge in his mind and developed it as far as he could. And we've heard from Jim that one of the things that happened was the publishing world could not handle that. And so the Promised Kingdom and the Pilgrimage remain unpublished, loosely bound notebooks. I have both in my library. Those could be made available, actually, both the Pilgrimage and the Promised Kingdom. They're technical, they're beautifully written for seminarians, but would be great for all of us. The insight I'd like to share about George's career, and I have an expert with me, Jim, to corroborate this, or perhaps he will have something other to say about this. George faced many pressures, not the least of which was from the Center for Swedenborgian Studies, formerly called the Swedenborgian House of Studies. George was as Jim mentioned, the professor at a distance. So George taught biblical exegesis to seminarians for 20 years. So he had a pressure to do that, which in a way took him a little away from his theoretical depth work of developing his theory, because he was teaching seminarians for 20 years. That became, it took his attention away from what I felt, and Jim, I think, could also feel. Boy, I wish George could have done more with the more depth developed stage theory from a Swedenborgian perspective. That's one of two forces. Actually, there was a much bigger one. George, I'm going to... Oh, boy. George loved the Swedenborg. He loved Swedenborgians so much. Jim can hear me. Can you hear me, Jim?
Yeah, I can hear you.
You can hear me. So he loved this outfit, as Cal Turley called it, an outfit. He was constantly writing about the future of the Swedenborgian Church, constantly helping it evolve as an organization, and this took his attention dramatically away from this individual work. He was working to help the interpersonal life of Swedenborgians to become a new church, and in 2015 he was the keynote speaker where he summed up his work. This was a life work, a keynote address at 2015. It was called Toward a Newer Church. That is what took his attention away. And I just wanted to offer my perspective on that, and I'll hand the mic back to Susanna.
My name's Bob. Would love to hear that talk or read that talk if it exists. The other thing, just about reading writings that have not been published, the PDF is a powerful tool, and that's, I mean, I have the Dole notes in book form, but I also have them in PDF on an iPad. And I'd love to know if the pilgrimage and the Promised Kingdom have been turned into PDFs, and if not, why not? And if not, when? And I would be happy to help. So we are in a profound self-publishing era. People are publishing anything and everything daily, all the time. I mean, there's just an infinite depth of available resources, and we should add those to the flow somehow.
I would scan mine for PDF, but it was printed on a dot matrix printer, and it's pretty light.
Well,
other
if I
comments?
can
Oh.
get copies, like so what you have, Gard, we can produce them. We can produce them in a really nice PDF, and then they can be posted. We'll have to figure that out. Certainly, they could be posted on the FNCA website. I would think. I'm not in charge of that website, but there are ways to post it. We could ask CSS if they'd be willing to post it on their website, and so forth. We could put them under resources in the denominational website. So I agree with that. These are kind of, it's always fun to study a thinker like Swedenborg is this amazing study. When he died, there were 20,000 pages of manuscript stuff in his study, and there was so much that he never published. And it's like, for example, the 6 volumes Apocalypse Explained. All of that, however, went to the Royal Academy of Sciences in Stockholm, and it took decades before people figured out, well, maybe we should go there and see what's in there, you know. And so that began decades of people combing through, finding all of these unpublished notebooks, many of which have been posthumously published. So I think it is fun to see somewhat of the behind-the-scenes work for the thought that finally makes it into published form. When you go deeply into a writer, then you care about the more complex journey of thought formation. I know in the general church, there was an early criticism in the publishing what we call the Green 30, the standard American edition that the Swedenborg Foundation published of the writings, because they included, that edition includes quite a number of unpublished manuscripts from Swedenborg. And there was criticism in early 20th century from the general church for the totally convention-dominated at that time Swedenborg Foundation for doing that. It's been a little flipped over time. Now what's evolved is a theory of thought among a lot of general church ministers called derived doctrine, where you can look even at the spiritual diary. We're talking a diary here. There will be that you can track the fullness of Swedenborg's thinking and use evidence that you find to shape a position on a doctrinal point, right? So now there's that attitude of not putting unpublished things in an improper place of power has completely flipped in the general church. That anything we find in those manuscripts is of value of understanding Swedenborg. That's maybe too long of a little bit of a riff off of the point of valuing the manuscripts that did not get published and that are different from the one that did get published. And for people who want to have a fuller kind of journey with where, frankly, the great master traveled. Julie?
I think in many ways it was unfortunate that they printed some of those that Swedenborg did not. I take the spiritual diary as a completely different side of Swedenborg that isn't as good as the published works and has been used, of course, against women. So, yeah.
Oh, well, I have no problem taking my stand on this point. I personally believe it's irresponsible not to do critical thinking on Swedenborg. And I did not grow up Swedenborgian, I traveled a long way in a beat-up Volkswagen out of a mainline tradition, jumping from a mainline seminary, because I wanted to study Bible with George Dole and psychology with Cal Turley. And I fought my way to get into this tradition. But I am not only suspicious, I'm a little critical of putting Swedenborg as an oracle that is a strict mouthpiece of God. That as if Swedenborg did not have his own contextual frameworks. We know the diary's the great place where we see that he wasn't faking it. When Swedenborg first died, there was a lot of criticism from some of his contemporaries, including one of his pastors, who thought he was making up his stories, his spiritual stories about speaking with people. He was openly called by some of the critics a charlatan. A charlatan means they're faking this whole thing here, right? But people didn't know for decades about his diary. When you get to the diaries, you see that he wasn't faking it. What was going on with him is a big story, and I have another piece that I've done on that called a historical perspective on positions of Swedenborg's sanity. There's many, many people who have commented from his own time period up to the present day trying to explain how a Swedenborg is possible, whether we're talking, and there's contemporary scholars who say he obviously has some form of mental illness, right? And other major writers say he was one of the great visionaries. It's a big chase, but I think it is wrong. I think it is irresponsible to put the power in a human voice, as brilliant and creative as he was, and to act as if all of his comments on social situations is from the mouth of God. We have to do critical thinking. We have to be willing to ask where are problems, where was Swedenborg weakest, where was Swedenborg strongest. That's my personal stance. I consider myself a postmodern scholar, where I constantly interrogate the foundations of the truth claiming I'm doing. I still find Swedenborg the most effective dialogue person for me personally. I have a lot of writers in my, I teach the history of spirituality. I have scads of writers that I admire very much, but frankly, nobody comes close to Swedenborg for me as an effective dialogue partner for understanding the beauty of this big cosmos that we're living in and a way to go through it. But I do not take all of his, he has a lot of anti-Semitic comments. And he has comments that I say this as, I'm taking as much space here to say this because I really think there's a problem in worldwide Swedenborgianism of overclaiming Swedenborg as an oracle, and it creates damages in some of the communities in the way certain categories of people are marginalized, and so there's a whole sort of way of separating out the parts of Swedenborg that I think are effective for spiritual formation, but not allowing Swedenborg to have the last word on all social questions.
Thank you.
Trevor, last question. Oh, that good. I was going to say let's break, and between lectures.
There's one online comment. Hold on.
Lynn and Ian Thompson have a couple of publishing options they'd like to share. EaglePress.com, EaglePearlPress.com, sorry, and SwedenborgStudy.com.
Thank you. And we can make those available to people. If you'd write those down, I'll put it on the board. Thank you for everyone. We'll be back at 10 for the second lecture.